Good day, and thank you for joining the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's virtual conversation today on assessing religious freedom in Egyptian curriculum reform. I'm Dwight Bashir, and I serve as Director of Outreach and Policy at USCIRF. For those who may be unaware, USCIRF is an independent bipartisan U.S. federal government body created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, also known as IRFA, to monitor religious freedom abroad and to make policy recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and Congress. Our work is led by 9 commissioners appointed by the President of the United States and the leadership of both political parties in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and is supported by a professional staff of about 20. We're here today to discuss a new USCIRF report titled Assessing Religious Freedom in Egyptian Curriculum Reform. This report evaluates the progress the Egyptian government has made in its stated intention to remove sectarian language and introduce pro-religious tolerance material in the textbooks used throughout its education system, as well as the challenges that remain. I'm joined today by USCIRF Commissioners Sharon Kleinbaum and Frank Wolf. Commissioner Kleinbaum will provide background and context on religious freedom in Egypt and the important role of education in fostering religious freedom in society. And Commissioner Wolf will tell you about USCIRF's recommendations to the U.S. government to encourage Egypt's efforts to promote religious freedom in its schools and the wider Egyptian society. We will then hear from some of the authors of the report, Rami Yacoub and Candace Hetzler. Rami is the executive director and Candace the development manager of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, also known as TIMEP, a Washington, D.C. based non-governmental organization that centers localized perspectives in the policy discourse to foster transparent, accountable, and just societies in the Middle East and North Africa. TIMEP oversaw the team of independent researchers whose work formed the basis of today's report. After our 2 panelists present the findings of the report, I'll moderate a brief conversation among the speakers with some opening questions. Then there'll be time for some questions from you, the audience, as well. To ask a question, please use the Zoom webinar's Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen to submit your question in writing, which you can do at any time during the event, starting right now. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Commissioner Sharon Kleinbaum.
Thank you so much, Dwight. And I'd like to join everyone in welcoming all of you to today's event. Before we hear from our guests today, I want to tell you about USCIRF's reporting on religious freedom in Egypt and the role of educational materials, curricula, textbooks, and religious freedom issues there. Egypt has been included in USCIRF's annual report for 20 years. For the first time in 2011, USCIRF recommended the U.S. Department of State designate Egypt as a country of particular concern, or CPC. That is the designation for countries that have committed the most egregious violations of religious freedom each year. Following improvements to religious freedom conditions in Egypt, but in recognition of the need for continued advancement in that area, in 2017, we began recommending Egypt for inclusion in the State Department's special watch list for those countries engaging in severe violations of religious freedom. Our 2022 annual report makes the same special watch list recommendation, documenting Egyptian authorities' ongoing and systematic violations of religious freedom in 2021. As the 2022 annual report indicates, Egypt has taken some notable first steps toward improving the climate for religious freedom in the country, while also maintaining some significant systematic impediments to religious freedom, including robust enforcement of its blasphemy statute and other laws against both members of religious minorities and human rights and religious freedom researchers and advocates. In 2021, the administration of President El-Sisi publicly promoted religious tolerance as a goal for Egyptian society, an important issue in a country with indigenous Copts, the single largest Christian minority in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as several other religious minorities, including Shia and Quranist Muslims, Baha'is, and Jehovah's Witnesses. The president himself again attended a Coptic Orthodox Christmas liturgy, expressed his respect for non-believers who are free to choose, and advanced several government-funded initiatives to restore historical houses of worship and sites sacred to Christians, Jews, and Shia Muslims. At this time last year, the Sisi administration also debuted the first ever national strategy for human rights, a 5-year plan that makes several references to programs to reform the curricula of schools run by the government in Al-Azhar, a leading academic institution with Sunni Islam, to remove exclusionary material and reflect messages of religious tolerance. The Ministry of Education has long promised such reforms, which for several years since 2018 had remained a work in progress. USCIRF commends the Ministry of Education and the drafters of the National Human Rights Strategy for their stated intentions to implement reforms to the national school curriculum. To that end, we commissioned research to assess progress made through the most recent academic year by the Egyptian government to reform the curricula of its primary and secondary education systems to promote religious freedom and remove intolerant material. The resulting report found that the 2021-2022 Egyptian mandated educational curriculum, EMEC, shows slight improvement in reducing the prevalence of religious sectarian language and rhetoric. However, as the experts will discuss in their presentation today, religionization of the EMEC remains endemic, with multiple compulsory subjects such as Arabic language and social studies advancing government-endorsed versions of Sunni Islam while underrepresenting, excluding, or negatively characterizing religious minorities such as non-Sunni Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Overall, the curriculum repeatedly positions Islamic religious and social norms rather than the concept of citizenship in the modern nation state as the basis for nationalism, marginalizing all non-Muslims, targeting Jews for inflammatory rhetoric, and glossing over the integral role of the indigenous pre-Arab Christian population, both in Egyptian history and today's cultural fabric. I'd now like to introduce my fellow Commissioner, Frank Wolf, who will offer his remarks on USCIRF's recommendations for US policy in Egypt.
Thank you, Commissioner Kleinbaum. I appreciate it very much. And I also want to thank and congratulate Dwight for his services to USCIRF over these many, many years. First, I'd like to acknowledge Egypt's continued importance to the United States as a strategic partner. USCIRF is also aware of and appreciates Egypt's public steps in support of religious tolerance and diversity. Some of the most recent actions, such as President Sisi's appointment this year to the first Christian judge ever to serve on the country's Supreme Court, help foster an air of greater religious tolerance in Egypt. Obviously, I personally believe more needs to be done by the Egyptian government. I will provide some context on religious freedom conditions in Egypt and why we highlighted the issue of educational reform as one of our 2022 annual report recommendations to the US government. USCIRF's overall recommendation, after evaluating religious freedom conditions in Egypt 2021, is that the State Department name Egypt on its special watch list for engaging in or tolerating severe violations of religious freedom. In light of those severe violations, we have also recommended that the United States conduct a comprehensive review of all financial assistance to Egypt and continue to withhold a congressionally designated portion of the $1.3 billion of annual foreign military financing, or FMF, that we give Egypt each year. Last week, Democratic lawmakers urged President Biden's administration to withhold the full portion, or $300 million of this year's FMF, which Congress has conditioned on human rights improvements in Egypt. Yet, the State Department has decided to withhold only $130 million of that aid, as it has already approved the other $170 million, noting that part of it was granted due to President Sisi's release, and we appreciate this, of 500 political prisoners out of a total of more than 60,000 in detention. USCIRF urges the U.S. government's continued scrutiny of Egypt's ongoing religious freedom violations, and we reiterate our recommendation to the United States to specify religious freedom among the broader human rights related conditions it places on aid to Egypt. Some violations are ones the Egyptian authorities have directly committed against their population. Among the most notable of these is the state security and the judiciary's repeated enforcement of the blasphemy statute and the corresponding deployment of other laws, such as the counterterrorism provisions and prohibitions on spreading false news against religious minorities and religious freedom advocates. Unsurprisingly, the Committee to Protect Journalists 2021 report identified Egypt as the world's third worst jailer of journalists. Third worst jailer of journalists, some of whom had records of researching and vocally advocating for freedom of religion or belief, or for the rights of religious minorities. As such, we have recommended that the United States urge Egypt to repeal its criminal blasphemy law. And until that is accomplished, and we hope it is accomplished soon, limit the conditions under which the laws apply and allow charged individuals to post bail. Additionally, Egyptian governors have maintained a very slow pace approving Christian applications to register and legalize as churches the buildings they've used for worship services, and given decades of obstacles to lawful church construction. Under 2016 law, which the government positioned as an easing of prior restrictions on Christian church use and renovation, governors have up to 4 months to process and approve or deny applications. Accordingly, one of USCIRF's 2022 recommendations is for the United States to encourage Egypt to comply with its own laws, time limits, and to accelerate the approval process to alleviate the backlog of applications. Other USCIRF recommendations address violations of religious freedom generated within a wider Egyptian society, and which the Egyptian government, through its action or inaction, tolerates. As today's report points out, Egypt has a millennia-long history, a great history of religious diversity. Yet Egyptian society contains persistent inequities based on religious affiliation, and members of religious minorities, especially Copts, continue to suffer violent attacks at the hands of their own neighbors and fellow citizens. USCIRF believes a thorough reformation of primary and secondary school educational curriculum to remove sectarian language and add religiously inclusive material would play a crucial role in encouraging successive generations of young Egyptians to appreciate their country's religious diversity. For that reason, our 2022 report recommended that the U.S. government encourage Egypt's follow through on its stated plans to reform its national curriculum. Based on the findings of our report today, as of academic year 21-22, Egypt has not achieved the full implementation of its promised curriculum reforms. As such, USCIRF will continue to emphasize our recommendation that the U.S. government engage with Egypt on the issue of religious freedom related reforms to the national curriculum. I personally am very disappointed in the failure to make more progress. Now we will return to the authors of today's report to provide more detail about their findings. Ramiyaka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Commissioner Wolf. I really appreciate it. It's very kind of you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Once again, my name is Rami Yacoub. I am the Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, also known as TIMEP. Before I start discussing the research, I would like to extend a sincere thanks to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedoms, not only for hosting us today, but for the years of dedication to defend and highlight issues related to freedoms of thought, conscious expression, association, and assembly. As a member of the global community of human rights defenders, I can tell you that the Commission's work matters, and that I, for one, am grateful for its existence and for the hard work put in by the people who make the Commission run and function. Further, I would like to thank the Commission for giving TIMEP the opportunity to work on such an exciting and timely research project. With that said, I'll dive right into it and tell you a little bit about how TIMEP went about conducting this research to determine whether the Egyptian government delivered on its promise to fix up its educational curriculum. For context, the modern Egyptian state has had a mandatory educational system that was intended or is intended to provide standardized education curricula and education at large to all or almost all students in the country. Unfortunately, historically speaking, these curricula have been marred with problematic language, incitement against minorities, hate speech, etc. For this research, the Tahrir Institute examined the Egyptian mandated educational curricula, or as referred to them generally in the research as EMECs, to gauge the education system as per educational reform goals laid out in the Egyptian National Human Rights Strategy in 2021, and even before that, as mentioned and stated by the Minister of Education in Egypt in 2018. While the curricula require improvements on many different fronts, the goal of this research was that we're discussing today was to examine whether positive steps were taken regarding sectarianism particularly. The Egyptian Ministry of Education states that they have been working at least since 2018 to evaluate, update, and improve the ways in which public school textbooks in the mandated curriculum instruct primary and secondary students on religion, religiosity, religious communities, and religious diversity. These efforts were initiated and mostly carried out under Minister of Education Tariq Shawqi, who has been replaced by Dr. Rada Higazi in August of this year, 2022. The project assessed whether or not the Ministry of Education has indeed made revisions, and if so, their progress in 1, making changes to or eliminate problematic narratives pertaining to religious freedoms, sectarianism, diversity, and inclusivity, such as those that may promote intolerance, incite hatred, discrimination, or violence towards religious minorities, including but not limited to Christians, Jews, and other non-Sunni Muslim communities. And the second, making revisions to the curricula that introduce material that proactively encourages religious freedom and inclusivity in terms of framing content and learning objectives. Very briefly, I'll jump into kind of an overview of the approach and methodology. We obtained copies of the EMECs applicable to all public schools as the primary source for this research. The research focused on curricula for 3 subjects: the Arabic language, religion, and history/social studies. Courses for 5th primary grade, which is the final year of primary school, the 3rd preparatory grade, which is the final year of middle school, and the 3rd secondary grade, which is the final year of high school. The primary source material were in the form of textbooks, including required supplemental readings such as novels and other material, roughly estimated at about 2,700 pages of material. We compared curricula in physical copies for the curricula of 2016, 17, and 18 as a baseline or a control variable to the current materials of the latest educational year, which is the 2021-2022, to determine if revisions occurred or not. The sources were reviewed to evaluate, number 1, the number of instances a given curriculum presented language or instructions that either violate inclusivity or promote sectarianism, and whether or not changes were made to any of these identified instances between the previous year and the current material. If revisions occurred, we noted that the revisions looked like how they looked like and how they affected the text and learning objectives. We wanted to determine if any revisions promoted inclusivity and tolerance also. We have also evaluated infusion of what we define as religiosity and religious text in curriculum of classes and subjects that do not address theology directly, to gauge the influence of religion on topics such as history, social studies, and language studies. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ken Setcher, to discuss some of the findings.
Thank you so much, Rami. So our key findings, initially the research team looked at the curriculum and determined that, some changes seemed that they had been made. But after further research and comparing the baseline to the previous year's curriculum or the current year curriculum, they realized that a lot of these changes were cosmetic at best and quite superficial, unfortunately. So For example, there's direct sectarianism, which affects non-Muslims, which means Christians, but as we mentioned earlier, there's more than just Christians, which are religious minorities in Egypt. So these examples remain present. This encourages students to harbor contempt and distrust of other students in their classrooms based on their faith. The overarching issue of religionization or religiosity, which Rami mentions, remains prevalent. So the influence of Islam throughout the curriculum material, whether that's in the form of samples of texts from Quran, or whether it's in the form of hadith, or whether it's in other examples, are prevalent throughout all the curriculum that we looked at. So that includes all the classes, not just the Arabic class. In the Arabic class, the Arabic language class, there's a lot of examples of piety or religious behavior, righteous behavior, excuse me. Examples of righteous behavior, which are showing students how they should act. This leaves non-Muslims and especially non-Sunni Muslims excluded and underrepresented, essentially. Most of the lessons include vague words describing objectives for students to learn. These words were often changed from the baseline curriculum that was looked at to the previous year's curriculum. So some of the titles, for example, inside the curriculum were changed only to include words such as human rights or tolerance, or a phrase such as rejecting violence and radicalism. However, these changes were simply with the title of the lesson. There was actually no real changes within the lesson that reflected any of this content. So when you do a comparison between the baseline year of 2016 to 2018 to the current year, the content is essentially the same for students to learn, except that the title or the heading has a title that's been corrected to appear to be more inclusive. Such objectives are usually not represented by the lessons or the suggested activities or any of the supplemental material. Most of the content hasn't changed significantly at all, and the previous iterations we witnessed have such terms with no further explanation of details. So a lot of the additions of terms such as human rights or tolerance aren't even explained. The words simply exist in the title, which is why we said that they're cosmetic and superficial at best. Ultimately, when we look through the research that our research team completed, there are, for example, in the third preparatory year in the Arabic curriculum, about 25% of the lessons include direct Quranic texts or hadith. So this is for all students across the board, not just Muslim students who have to study the Arabic language. When they're studying the Arabic language, the examples that are used are religious examples, which are only for Islam. Another quick example that we'll talk about, in the Islamic course, which only Muslim students attend, most of the curriculum, of course, talks about Islam, but it only talks about Sunni Islam. So this is another way of not including religious minorities in the religious classes. In social studies, for example, no changes have been made from previous years to current years, although social studies, you would think, related to history is the perfect place for human rights and tolerance to be discussed. No changes were made between the years. And if we go through and look at Arabic and religion, Islam, and social studies for the third secondary years, also no changes or very few changes were made. I think that concludes some of the key findings, but we are really interested to hear your questions and to answer more.
Thank you very much, both Rami and Candice, for your brief overview and findings. Before I kick things off with a question, I want to remind the audience, if you could please use that Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. If you type your question, we'll get it, and we'll get a chance to ask those in just a few minutes. I wanted to start off by asking about the report, because it notes that the plans for education that the Egyptian government set forth in its Sustainable Development Strategy, known as Egyptian Vision 2030, one of the strategy's goals is to offer an education system that contributes to the, quote, development of a proud, creative, responsible, and competitive citizen who accepts diversity and differences and is proud of his country's history. So I want to ask you all, what potential reforms to the future curricula do you think would genuinely help the Egyptian government fulfill this mission statement for its education system, given that I just recall, so many visits to Egypt and the various government officials saying what a proud history and how they lived next to someone who was Jewish when they were a child, and a lot of this diversity that existed. And it's a pity that things are they are. What do you think some of those genuine reforms need to be to get to where they have that vision that they put forward themselves?
I guess I'll jump in. Dwight, we're talking hypothetically speaking, correct? Like, what are the things that potentially could help them get to this point? I would say one of the key, and I think that's important to look at from our research, one of the key findings is the religionization of the curriculum. I think that's one of the main things that needs to be eliminated. A lot of the references made towards how an Egyptian citizen should be and the idea of nationalism is really intertwined in the curricula with religion, with Sunni Islam. That this is where an individual, an upstanding citizen, should get their pride and joy in the nation of Egypt. Even though it is, as with all due respect to the faith of Islam, which is definitely has its major influence on Egypt and is a part of its identity. It is important, as you said, that Egypt has a very rich and diverse history, but it always ties back in the curricula, particularly in the Arabic language and social studies, which includes history, that the identity of citizenship and citizenry is really tied to religion. I think if real work is done to kind of not eliminate, but perhaps just bring this down a little bit, and instead highlighting nationalism, perhaps, or how other universal human rights values, I think it would be very helpful in that context.
Candice, did you have anything else you wanted to add on that?
I echo Rami's sentiment. While the researchers were working on the report, one thing that they noticed is just, this profuse religionization throughout the curriculum. And I think that rather than increasing that in order to represent more minorities, I think that maybe the smart thing would be to generally decrease and focus more on a national identity. Separate from that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the foundation of the national identity or civics or social studies for students.
Thank you. Your report also comments on the conspicuous lack of curriculum material discussing the significant and integral contribution of Coptic Orthodox Christians and other Christians to Egypt's past and present. Why do you feel the marginalization of Copts in the curriculum is cause for concern, not just for Christian students and their families, but for their classmates and those of other religious backgrounds and Egyptian society at large?
I'm sorry, I think I have some connection issues on my end, but hopefully you can hear me. Dwight, could you please repeat the question, because you broke up on my end, sorry.
Sure, let me go ahead and do that. I was just saying that your report comments on the lack of curriculum material discussing the significant contributions of Copts, to Egypt's past and present history. Why would you feel, or why do you feel that the marginalization of Copts in the curriculum is a cause for concern, not just for Christian students and their families, but for their classmates, others of other religious backgrounds, and Egyptian society writ large?
Sure. Thank you for repeating the question. Thank you for the question itself. I think it's a cause for concern, like, as you said, not just for Copts, and it's not only the marginalization of Coptic historical figures. It is the marginalization or the lack of highlighting of the profound and great deeds, historical deeds of other Egyptians of other ethnicities, religions. And I think it's an issue because if we do, this is kind of the basis as to where diversity starts, where a student can know and learn that there are other individuals from different faiths that were as, for example, patriotic or as important and significant in their country's history. But when there are no examples at all, or very, very few, it just kind of perpetuates and magnifies this notion that there's only one segment in society and everything else is either foreign or different or both. And in that context, it makes the idea of having, like, first of all, you don't know much about how this community of non-Sunni Muslims have contributed to the history of your country as a student. But also you feel that kind of foreign feeling towards your neighbor or towards individuals that you meet. And I think this also, again, it's not an issue pertaining only to the marginalization of Coptic figures in history, but also Jewish or non-affiliates or perhaps Baha'is, right? There are a lot of other individuals and other communities that really are not, ought to be highlighted in Egyptian history curriculums, but they're not. Candace, I'm not sure if you'd like to add anything.
Yeah, thank you. That was very insightful. I appreciate that. That kind of leads me to my last question. Is going to be directed more towards Candace. She talked about some of the findings before I turn to my two commissioners to see if they might have a comment or question themselves. But a lot of what you said and kind of summarized, Candace, was that there's been a lot of cosmetic work being done with headings to various chapters and lessons. But when you look at the content, more of the same. I remember going to Egypt and meeting with the Minister of Education as part of a USCIRF delegation. And there was a lot of optimism at the time, a few years ago. And you mentioned there was a change just in August, but he had been educated in a Western setting, was very much looking forward to, influencing this, bringing this curriculum into the 21st century, which he felt was just on the basis of, curriculums around the world, very much under where it should be. But you're talking about cosmetic work on sectarianism and so on. What's it going to take, in your estimation, to get some of these more substantial, genuine reforms that the government itself is committed to? Because we've seen cosmetics for decades, as I think Commissioner Wolf alluded to in his remarks, wanting to see more change because, frankly, we've heard this for a long time. But in your estimation, what can get them? Because I do believe there's some will there within parts of the government, but there seems to be impediments when it comes to actual implementation.
Sure, yeah. Most likely, Rami will be able to speak more in depth about exactly what it takes. But from my personal lived experience, having spent a great deal of time in Egypt, I think it is political will, of course. And I agree with you. When the last education minister came in, a lot of Egyptians also were very excited. There were a lot of big statements made about what the potential could be for the state of education in Egypt. And I think that Egyptians themselves were really excited about those possible changes, not just to the curriculum, but to the educational system as a whole. But of course, in Egypt, there's a lot of bureaucracy. There's also a lot of people working within ministries who are just really normal people who are tasked with making those changes. And so it's what it would take to really create that change. On the one hand is political will, but on the other hand, I think is also a lot of folks who are working within the bureaucracy to be given the resources that they need in order to make that change happen. And I think that that's not just, of course, financial resources, but it's also maybe some conversations within the Egyptian Ministry of Education to really understand what is possible for them. Perhaps Rami could speak more about what he sees might be needed to make that happen.
Thank you, Candace. No, I think you summarized it very well. Honestly, there's one point that perhaps I can reflect on here very quickly and expand on. It's the political will. I think, as Candace also alluded, that Egypt has gigantic bureaucracies, and even though that that there's committees and subcommittees that work on these curriculum, but to better highlight what we mean by political will, it is actually expending the political capital to fight and push back against perhaps more conservative aspects or branches within the bureaucracy. The curriculum and the curricula as they stand right now are there this way because of influence of certain individuals or sects that want the curriculum to be this way, right? This was an effort that was made by individuals and groups to make sure that the language within these lessons are as such. And because of Egypt's nature and how the regime is structured, it really requires political will and the will to expend political capital domestically from the top down to say, no, this needs to be changed, and it will be changed. But there's a lack of, or perhaps in my humble assessment, that there's a lack of feeling that there's a need to expend political capital on this issue to fight back against these organizations or these groups or these individuals or this influence at large, this more conservative influence. Until that happens, and until, as Candace perfectly said, the bureaucrats that are responsible for modernizing these curriculum are given the resources, whether it's the training, whether it's financial, or whatever it may be, but also that support from the top to these individuals to push back against this more regressive or / conservative vision of the curriculum, I don't think anything will change.
Thank you. Let me thank you again. I see some questions coming in from the audience. Thank you. Keep doing that on the Q&A function. Write them in. Before we turn to your questions in the audience, I'm going to turn to Commissioner Kleinbaum and Commissioner Wolf to see if you have any comments or questions you'd like to add at this time.
Well, thank you so much, Dwight. And I just want to add my thanks to Candace and to Rami for a fantastic report and really thoughtful and insightful and really helpful to those of us who are on the outside. And the question I think will become for us at USCIRF is how will this influence our recommendations to the United States government, and what we can do to help influence the political will in Egypt. And I'm not sure if you are prepared to make any statements about that, and maybe that's what we have to do inside of USCIRF. But clearly, we have to help create the environment so that the political will has some incentives to do something. But if you'd like to just comment on that, I'd certainly appreciate it. And thank you both again so much.
I'll just jump right in. Perhaps Candace wants to add something afterwards. I think, Commissioner, you've summed it up very well when you said there should be incentives. I think there's so much wrong, perhaps, with the situation in Egypt, whether it's the economy or human rights conditions at large, as Commissioner Wolf has alluded also to the number of prisoners, political prisoners and prisoners of conscience, that sometimes, unfortunately, the education issue, which is very important, it's paramount for the advancement of the Egyptian society and on many fronts, is kind of put on the back burner. I think one of the things that the Commission can do and must do, in my humble opinion, is to maintain placing education as an important and paramount issue that needs focus. It cannot be forgotten. And I think that's the one quick recommendation, or I would say.
Thank you.
Commissioner Wolf, would you like to jump in? You're on mute. If you unmute yourself. There you go.
Well, thank you for the question. I was thinking as you were going along, and I want to thank those who put the report together. These are my own views, but Egypt's a great nation. I mean, we all know Jesus and Mary and Joseph went to Egypt to get away from what was taking place. I mean, and we were all, most of us in the US were pleased that President Al-Sisi got into power. But since 1978, the United States provided over 50 billion, I went on earlier this morning, 50 billion in military aid and 30 billion in economic assistance. Quite frankly, I think you should just cut the budget. I think you should cut the foreign aid in a significant way. I mean, this is so important. I mean, the Jewish community the population was up around 80,000. I was there once, and I remember the leader of the Jewish community, they said we're roughly 20, some or more, or we're pretty old. I think that the report shows it's 10, maybe 3. Some people say this has to be done, and this enhances the greatness of Egypt. So I think there should be congressional delegations and other delegations going over to meet with President Sisi. And I was very pleased when he went into power versus who was there before. But this has to change. And if it doesn't change, my own view is you can't continue to fund and fund and fund and fund. It isn't like this has been going on at 1978, 80 billion. So I think you have to look at cutting the foreign aid, but hopefully and convincing the leadership, in particular, President Sisi. It's a great nation, wonderful, wonderful people. This is something that has to be done, and it has to be done not over in the next 10 years, but something next year. But thank you very much. Thanks for putting together the report.
Thank you, Commissioner Wolf. Let me now turn to some audience questions. Thank you again. We have a question, acknowledging how critical this report was and commending the researchers for the work. The question is, what is the role of clerics in this reform, if at all, and what have been their reactions thus far? Can you talk to, and they may be alluding to those at Al-Azhar, but also other clerics that might be involved or reacting to this?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that the report goes in depth, not necessarily in depth about, but really highlights clearly, is that aside from the Egyptian mandated educational curricula, the ECs, there is a parallel universe of education that's happening in Egypt, which is the Al-Azhar educational system, which really is a very rudimentary basic education system where students are taught Arabic and extensive Islamic religion, if you will, theologically. And we obviously did not have the capacity to look at in depth into this, but I think this is also another area where it's, in the lack of a better term, it's a can of worms, like it needs to be addressed and requires a lot of attention. And I think it is hard to assess the role of the clerks, particularly. I think it is when it comes to the EMECs, but I think it is definitely prevalent. And it kind of, this question kind of brings me back to my point that I was making earlier about the will to expend political capital to push back against conservative views. These conservative views are not coming from thin air. They are coming from certain sects and clerks. Not necessarily all of them in Al-Azhar, by the way. A lot of them are perhaps more on the Salafi side, or and as perhaps our audience knows, like Sunni Islam is not governed like in a kind of Catholic Pope way, if you will. There's, it's more on the more independent way. Al-Azhar is a governing body, but it's not necessarily mandatory for you to be regarded as a pious or legitimate Sunni clerk. So it will, I think that's perhaps the kind of a quick answer to that there is definitely influence. There's influence in Al-Azhar education system, which needs a deeper look on its own, but also the influence of independent clerks on individuals that are within the bureaucratic system.
Thank you very much. That kind of is connected to another question. I'll skip to this other one, though. You mentioned Al-Azhar. I know you weren't able to compare the state curriculum to that of Al-Azhar, but there's a question. Can you shed light on the percentage of population in state schools versus Al-Azhar's school system? Because we do know there's a parallel system with some students in it. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I would be reluctant to make statistics up, to be frank with you. I am unable to really answer that directly, but we do know that particularly what we can say about Al-Azhar educational system, if you will, that it's more popular and prevalent in provinces or / governorates of Egypt that are outside of the metropolitan areas. So the Delta, in southern Egypt, areas where families are perhaps farmers or laborers and would like their children to be involved in their work. So it's kind of reducing the amount of hours that is being spent in school. So we can't speak about I can't speak personally about the percentages at the moment, but I can tell you that geographically speaking, it is more popular or relied upon in more rural or non-metropolitan areas.
I can make an addition, actually. So there are about 20 million students enrolled in public school, governmental school in Egypt, and there's about just under 2 million who are enrolled in the Al-Azhar system. So that may color in a little bit of Rami's comments, just to make the comparison. But so it's maybe 10% or so of the student population would be the difference between who's in public school and who's in Al-Azhar school.
Thank you very much. No, that's helpful. And that tracks with what I think we heard from the government a few years ago in terms of the numbers. But there was also interest, relating to that question. I know within the Ministry of Education to kind of consolidate these systems so that there wouldn't be separate tracks, maybe teaching very different curricula. But that certainly hasn't come to pass, and maybe some of those interests didn't really translate or haven't translated yet, but thank you for that. There is a question, and I think maybe just a slight misunderstanding. It says, with regard to the human rights and religious freedom situation, does the panel think that Arabic should not be taught, should not be a compulsory course in an Arab country? And they got the impression maybe some people were upset by the fact that Egypt is teaching Arabic in its schools. I just want you all to give you a chance to talk about, I mean, obviously that's the language of the country. So if you want to reflect on that question, that'd be great.
Maybe also Candice will probably jump in after, but no, I don't think there's any suggestion or feelings, whether negatively or positively, about whether Arabic is a compulsory subject or not. In fact, if when it comes to if we're going to go down the route of compulsory education, I think teaching the native language is kind of, or the modern native language is kind of important. And again, it kind of helps every student to become literate and be an engaging member of society. So if I understood the question correctly, I just wanted to clarify that there's no recommendations on our part or in the report in any way, shape, or form to make Arabic as a language not, or we're suggesting that Arabic should not be taught compulsively. The recommendations are to take religion out of the or religionization of the material. And Candice, if you'd like to perhaps speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, so just to clarify, of course, I believe that I can speak on behalf of the panel. Like, there's no issue at all with Arabic being taught in Egyptian schools or anywhere in Egypt or anywhere where there are Arab speakers. And as a student of the language, I love it so much and would never advise anyone not to teach it or to learn it. But I think that the issue is that the religionization or the examples. So all the Egyptian students have to take Arabic language, but a lot of the content that they study is based on Islam. So there are Christian students who are studying Arabic language, but the exercises in their workbook have examples from Quran or from Hadith. So this is just one issue that we brought up in the report. The issue is not with the language at all, but it's with the content or the exercises or the activities that are used to teach the language, which maybe sometimes are not totally inclusive or representative of all the minorities that may exist in that classroom or outside of that classroom. So I think that, just to reiterate that point, it's not an issue at all with the language, but the content that is being used to teach the language sometimes.
Dwight, if I may, just one quick addition also to that. Arabic is such a rich language. There are thousands upon thousands of literary works that could be used to help students learn the language and practice it. Tons of poetry from even before Islam still survives that could be used to teach students. So there's always this argument in Egypt that is being said when people have been trying to fix the curricula over the years, particularly to the religion part. They would say, well, if you want to teach a person to speak Arabic properly, they will, whether you like it or not, they must, learn examples from the Quran to know proper grammar. But I think there are a lot of experts out there that would absolutely disagree, not undermining the Quran even as a literary work at all. In fact, yes, it definitely is something that is, that could teach a person how to speak proper Arabic. But there are other ways that are more inclusive, and that's what we're suggesting.
Great. Thank you very much for clarifying that and making that evident. There's a question about the curriculum's anti-Jewish rhetoric, and this has been a big issue going back, and I can recall, as long as I've been around at the commission. But the lack of differentiation towards disapproval of the state of Israel and Israel's policies and anti-Semitism. Do you feel that the text successfully differentiates between criticism of Israel and its policies and hostility toward or disapproval of Judaism and the anti-Semitism that we've seen so virulently propagated by different aspects of the government and society?
I think also I'll give Candace the floor after, but I think there's a very unfortunate fluidity between anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli policies at large. It is rather disturbing. It's one of those examples that really stood out in the research where students are kind of being warned and to heed the Jewish community based on the actions of the Jewish community 1400 years ago, right? Candace, I don't know if you want to reflect a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so the researchers noticed, for example, when reviewing the curriculum, as Rami said, there are mentions of what Jewish people did over 1,000 years ago, but the problem is not so much the history of what happened or the framing of it, but also linkages between what happened over 1,400 years ago and, for example, the 1973 war, between Israel and Egypt. So linking these together and drawing very ancient events or ancient people which happen with present modern time history, and then putting a sentence in the curriculum that says to the students, to be aware of the treachery of the Jews or something like this. Of course, so there's no line between modern events and ancient events, and then there's a blurry line between the religion, the people, the culture, the government of Israel. All these things are kind of mixed together right now. There's no differentiation of them in the curriculum.
Thank you for addressing that. There's a question, it's come up a bit, but I want to give you an opportunity to see if there's some other examples. The question, can you provide some other examples of ways in which the report writers saw religionization of the curriculum? You alluded to some of that maybe in the Arabic language study or in social studies, but are there particularly in subjects outside of religion where that the religionization comes in and then impacts the student who is consuming that course?
Yeah, sure. I think one of them, maybe I touched on that a bit earlier, which is what is called in Arabic al-muwatna, which is the citizenry, like the act of citizenry, the act of being a citizen in a country or in the system of a nation. I think that's obviously part of social studies, and it's something that it's a thematic issue that carries on until you graduate from high school. But it's intrinsically tied, like the values of a good citizen are intrinsically tied through and through with the model, like the righteous model of Sunni Islam. Good citizenry is based on the ethics provided within the faith of Sunni Islam. And I think this one example really stood out to me personally, and I want to point out that it's not just Candace and I who worked on this. We had a solid team of number of researchers that have done a lot of work, and who are not with us today. But that particular example stood out to me because I think it's a core issue. It is an issue that, aside from Arabic, where you'd have to, for example, memorize and recite hadith or a surah from the Quran, to demonstrate, good linguistic skills, right? Yes, this is problematic and it's clear cut, right? Like you can say, we want to replace this, take this out, replace it with something else that will give the student the same amount of linguistic practice, sure. But the issue of like having these infused ideas within social studies about like how citizenry and being a good citizen is derived from Sunni Islam and the basics of it is really problematic, because it is in some cases more subtle. In some cases, it's not as blatant and blunt that you can say, okay, we're going to change this. This requires a substantial like step back and looking at the curriculum at large and really changing the whole process of drafting this curriculum from the get-go. Hopefully that answers the question. I'm not sure if it does.
I can add just a few other quick examples for those who maybe haven't read the report. There's plenty of examples in the report that the researchers highlight. But if we look, for example, at the 5th primary grade for the social studies curriculum, the religionization of the content, for example, is in this curriculum, they look at Egypt before Islam. So the period before Islam came to Egypt. They look at Cleopatra, they look at the rise of Christianity and these things. If you compare the sections in the book, which is devoted to Egypt before Islam and the rise of Islam after this, the section of the rise of Islam is about twice the number of pages as Egypt before Islam. So in this example, there's very little content that covers pre-Islamic Egypt, and then a lot more content devoted to what Egypt's history was after Islam came to Egypt. So this is one example. And then also just like the framing of historical figures. Jesus is mentioned in certain social studies content, but there's certain spins that the researchers identified which may lead the reader or the students to look at Jesus in a more Islamic light rather than in a Christian way. So there's a lot of complications there, and the report has many examples, and I'm sure for anyone interested, it would be a great read.
Great, thank you so much. Another quick clarifying question. You mentioned earlier that, if you're Muslim, you take the Islam curriculum, but if you're Christian, there's a separate curriculum there. Could you just elaborate a bit about what that means and what levels of the state curriculum can you take for religious studies, on Islam and Christianity, where that separates out?
Well, I mean, I think it was it the 2nd or 3rd grade that starts? I'm not sure the exact year that academic year it starts, but so how it looks like, perhaps for the audience if they're unfamiliar, what it looks like is that you have a classroom in school X, Y, or Z, where you have a number of students, probably a substantial majority are Muslim, and you have 5-10%, maybe less, of non-Muslim, most likely Christian, Coptic Orthodox students. And when it's time for the class for religion, the Christian students are usually just told to leave the room completely. They're kicked out of the room. And in a lot of the schools, unfortunately, that don't have the resources, Christian students don't have a teacher to teach them the subject of Christianity. And essentially, it's kind of it's very interesting because with other minorities, Egyptian minorities, even though they're small in percentages, they still count as humans. They're usually also kicked out of the room because they're not Sunni Muslims, right? But they also are not really Christian, so they have nowhere to go. And usually, even with schools that have the resources to have a Christian subject teacher, it's kind of an act of really like adding to the segregation psyche. And literally, if you go through the education system in Egypt, you will at some point be segregated out or witness it on a weekly basis during your 2 classes per week for religion class, right? You'll be sitting there, and as a child, you're forced to take part in this active segregation, right? So the subject of religion itself is kind of really problematic in its existence, because again, it's creating divide lines. So I think that's kind of a quick summary of how this unfortunate experience goes.
Yeah, I'll just speak
Please.
for 30 seconds quick to put this into context, but in comparison to how it's conducted in other countries, for example, in the UK, there's a world religions class. All students must attend it no matter what their religion is. They all sit together in the same classroom and they learn briefly about all religions. So in Egypt, for example, it's not like this. As Rami mentioned, your students are more educated in their religion based on what their family's religion is, not based on what they claim their religion is. That's what you're born into, essentially. So this culture of segregation starts very young because students are taught, as Rami said, that one group of students has one thing to learn and another group of students has another thing to learn, and they're not really studying each other's or learning from each other, or there's no exchange really. The Christian students don't learn anything about Islam in the religion class for Islam, and the Islamic students don't learn about Christianity at all either. So that's one thing to bring up. There's a physical segregation, there's a culture of segregation that happens within education, and then there's really not much exchange to learn from each other about each other.
Well, it sounds like the basis of a potential another report, really. I mean, this is a very important aspect, and I'm glad you touched on that, even if briefly here at the end of our hour, which unfortunately we've arrived at. I want to thank USCIRF Commissioners Sharon Kleinbaum and Frank Wolf for leading this important and timely conversation on educational reform in Egypt. And to our expert panelists, thank you so much, Rami Yacoub and Candace Hetzler of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or TIMEP, as they're known, for sharing their deep expertise and insight through this report, and to the team of researchers that contributed. I also want to thank Danielle Ashbahian, our Supervisory Public Affairs Specialist, and Dylan Scheck-Snyder, our Victims List and Outreach Specialist, as well as members of the research and policy staff at USCIRF for their work on this event. If you'd like to learn more about USCIRF's work on religious freedom in Egypt and our recommendations for U.S. policy, I encourage you to visit our website at www.uscirf.gov. I'd like to add that today's conversation will be the last time I actually moderate before moving on from USCIRF later this week after just over 20 rewarding and memorable years here. Today's discussion has had special significance for me since I covered religious freedom in Egypt for many years earlier in my career at USCIRF. And when TIMEP emerged on the scene in early 2014 here in Washington, D.C., they asked me to write a piece on religious freedom conditions in Egypt. They covered issues that weren't getting the kind of attention that they should, including freedom of religion or belief. And you can find that article on their website still, 8 years later, to get a sense of what religious freedom was like then and where we've come today. It's been my honor and privilege to serve at USCIRF and moderate many of these USCIRF conversations over the past few years. In the months ahead, of course, USCIRF will continue to host similar conversations on other countries and issues at play. As always, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Have a wonderful day.